Hi, everyone. This is Saran. Our project is titled Reducing Inequality by a Fair Distribution. What this allows us to do is draw from a variety of different literatures, namely resource allocation, task allocation, and fair distribution. But our goal is to combat inequality within systems. So what we end up devising is a fairness-aware, Pareto-efficient matching recommendation system. And what happens in literature is, though they take a game theoretical approach, literature for the large part has failed to kind of talk about inequality when it comes to recommendation systems, and more so they don't try to achieve fairness throughout the entire system. Task allocation has come close as a subject area, but task allocation is focused on robots, and robots are largely easy to control than human employees. So why is AI needed? Well, obviously, having a multi-agent framework allows us to capture this dynamic behavior of non-homogeneous and, model it after human agents. And additionally, we'll take a game theoretical approach too, so we can update our criterion stepwise, right? So here's our mathematical model very briefly. We have a set of workers, we have a set of tasks, and we have a set of working stations. We index it, and we form this allocation matrix as to what task and station gets assigned to what worker. And of course, every worker gets a reward function, which is consisted of how much income they gain and how much the workload for a certain task is. And we start to establish and play with this idea of gaps, and we'll get much more into that. And keep in mind, I said in the beginning, we're trying to find a Pareto efficient allocation as well. And we start to formalize this problem. We can see the function here, the constraint being the workload and the distance from the income gained by the employee. And Pareto optimality, I won't talk too much about it, but essentially we come up with this fairness recommendation, which basically says, look, here's where I'm at right now. Here's how the tasks are being distributed. And then there's an ideal scenario. So what's the difference between where I'm at and what's the ideal? And that will help me establish how fair the system is. Okay, we start to utilize a greedy algorithm, but this will run into a local optimum or a local maxima, right? But this is still preventing us from establishing a global maxima for the entire system. So reward calculations are as you would imagine, but we introduce three additional criterion: the emotional, cognitive, and physical levels for workers, as well as how difficult that task is. And we formalize this process. We maximize reward, we minimize the gap, and we simplify it. And so the simplified rendition is kind of the crux of this paper, because what it allows us to do is to take into account what the criterion for the workers are and find the distance from how difficult that task is. And we're trying to minimize the gap between that, given these two different, sub-criterion, right? And so we finally come up with the fairness-aware matching recommendation for the system. And it's exactly how you would imagine based on what I've described. And this is the formal model for it. Well, you could see our experiment here, and you could see that we have two gaps, where we have the resource gap and as well as the fairness gap. And you can see, based on the three criterion for the workers, we've calculated a status for the 10 workers, there's 10 tasks, and there's a difficulty level, or the TDL for each task. And then we establish a gap. We can find the gap for each of these, for each worker assigned to each task. And we come up with the resource gap and the fairness gap. We experiment with 4 different ways: a randomized matching, a minimum, trying to minimize a gap without fairness, with fairness, and finally a fairness-driven initiative. And you can see the difference in the scores, fairness only achieving the highest amount of fairness because we're trying to minimize, remember, and you can see how the resource gap is also minimized in these various different methodologies we've utilized.
Hi, this is Chen, and in the summary, our system could assign tasks to different workers appropriately, and we believe that our system could be also applicable in other fields. For example, in the matching, employees and employers because we also want to minimize the gap between the employee's ability and employers' requirements. But our system could also have some limitations. For example, some workers may not follow our recommendation suggestions, even though they know it's good for them. And also some workers may prefer to do more work and earn more. And these are what we need to solve in future studies. And here we have listed some questions that we think important. This could help you to understand our project. The first question is, what is fairness? How do you define fairness in this project?
Well, fairness is an interesting thing because it depends totally on the system. Is it always feasible? I would say no. But if depending on what I'm trying to fairly allocate throughout everyone in the system, I can find the criterion and then find the gap really.
Yeah, and the second question is, in this project, resource gap has been defined, and why do you want to minimize that?
Well, of course, appropriating the appropriate tasks or assigning appropriate tasks to the correct worker would help us minimize this resource gap, so we're not wasting resources. And if we price the task itself well, then the worker itself would be maximizing its profits.
Yeah, and the third question is, we have used the greedy algorithm, and how do you define the greedy algorithms and avoid the limitation?
Sure. As I mentioned before, greedy algorithms have a problem which they run into a local optima or a local maxima by its nature, because I'm trying to find an optimal strategy or an optimal reward at the quickest possible way in a brute force approach. But that doesn't solve the problem of finding something called a global optima, right? So how do we overcome that? Well, we use the fairness criterion and the fairness gap that we've established in this paper to look at the entire system. Thanks, everybody.